Prague, May 27, 1942. 10:28 in the morning. The city lay still beneath a pale spring sky. Trams rattled along their iron tracks through cobblestone streets still slick from the previous night's rain. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Workers moved to their factories. Children, too young to understand the nature of the occupation that had reshaped their world, walked along the pavements of a city that no longer fully belonged to them. On the surface, Prague in the spring of 1942 appeared almost calm, almost ordinary. That appearance was, of course, a lie, and in a matter of minutes it would shatter permanently at the hairpin curve where Kirchmayerova Trida bent sharply downward into the boulevard known as V. Holzevik in the working district. Of Liebeck, two men stood waiting. They had been waiting for months, in one sense. In another sense, they had been waiting for years. One of them held a raincoat folded carefully across his arm. Beneath it, concealed entirely from the pedestrians and the tram passengers and the ordinary life of a May morning, was a Sten submachine gun, loaded and ready. A few meters away, the second man carried a briefcase. Inside that briefcase was a modified No. 73 anti-tank grenade, its original casing adapted and lightened by British engineers at the Special Operations Executive, engineered for one specific purpose on one specific morning against one specific man. The briefcase rested at the man's side with an ordinariness that was almost absurd given what it contained. It was an unremarkable object, round, worn at the corners, the kind of briefcase a clerk might carry to an office. It was, in historical reality, one of the most consequential objects of the entire Second World War. To understand why two men were standing at a tram stop on a Wednesday morning prepared to give their lives for a single act of violence, it is necessary to understand who it was they were waiting for. Because the man in the approaching car was not simply a senior officer of the Nazi state. He was, in the most accurate assessment that history can render, the man most responsible for turning the abstract ideology of racial extermination into an organized, continent-spanning administrative program. He was the man who had taken the hatred that lived in the speeches and the pamphlets and the rallies and had given it the architecture of bureaucracy. He had given it timetables, train schedules, coordination protocols, and conference minutes. He had given the Holocaust its operational machinery. His name was Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Tristan Eugene Heydrich was born on March 7, 1904, in the city of Halle an der Saale, a mid-sized German city some 20 miles northwest of Leipzig. His father, Bruno Heydrich, was a composer and opera singer of modest reputation who had founded a local music conservatory. His mother was a pianist. The home was cultured, disciplined, and deeply German in its nationalism. The young Reinhard inherited his father's gifts. He was a gifted violinist throughout his life, a man capable of producing genuine beauty from an instrument, which made the nature of what he became all the more disturbing to those who encountered him. He was tall, fair-haired, angular in feature. He possessed, by every account, a quality of physical presence that projected both dominance and menace in equal measure. He had joined the German Navy in 1922, served as a signals and communications officer, and had been expelled from the officer corps in 1931 after a military court found He had dishonored the officer corps through his behavior toward a woman to whom he had promised marriage. He had left that woman, the daughter of a senior naval commander, for another, a fanatical National Socialist named Lena von Ossen. It was through his new wife's connections that Heydrich found his way to Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, who was at that time seeking to create an internal intelligence service for the Nazi Party. The meeting between Himmler and Heydrich was, by the accounts of those who witnessed its aftermath, one of the most fateful encounters in 20th century history. Himmler was so impressed by Heydrich's proposals, which Heydrich had assembled from memory in a matter of minutes, that he brought him into the SS in August of 1931 and tasked him with building what would become the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service of the Reichsführer's SS. Within 2 years, Heydrich had transformed it into the most significant intelligence agency within the Nazi Party. By 1934, it had been designated the sole agency authorized to gather political intelligence inside the Third Reich. By 1936, Heydrich commanded not only the SD, but the Gestapo and the criminal police forces, the full architecture of Nazi Germany's internal terror. And in September 1939, with the invasion of Poland and the formal start of the Second World War, all of these agencies were formally unified under Heydrich's command in the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, the one office, the one man, the one instrument through which the Nazi state would prosecute its campaign of racial annihilation. Hitler himself, who rarely spoke of any man with genuine unease, privately described Heydrich as a highly gifted but also very dangerous man, and stated that the Nazi movement had to retain his services precisely because of that danger. Himmler, who outranked him and yet seemed in certain moments to stand in something approaching awe of him, called Heydrich indispensable. In occupied Czechoslovakia, the population he now governed had given him simpler names. They called him the Blonde Beast, the Hangman, the Butcher of Prague. At that, he had arrived in Prague on September 28, 1941, summoned by Hitler to replace the Reich protector Konstantin von Neurath, whose relatively measured approach to the Czech population had been deemed insufficiently brutal for the needs of the war effort. The Czech lands were critically important to Germany. Their factories produced tanks, artillery, and munitions in quantities that the German military required. Sabotage had been increasing. Resistance movements, stimulated by the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, had begun striking at the industrial infrastructure. Hitler wanted the resistance crushed and productivity restored. He sent Heydrich. What followed in the weeks after Heydrich's arrival was swift, methodical, and savage. In October and November of 1941 alone, Protectorate Special Courts sentenced 342 people to death and handed 1,289 more directly to the Gestapo. The Czech Prime Minister, Alois Elias, who had maintained secret contact with the government in exile in London, was arrested, tried before a people's court, and sentenced to death, though the execution was held in reserve to be used as a political instrument. The Theresienstadt concentration camp was established under Heydrich's direct orders in November 1941. Within months, more than 20,000 Czech Jews had been deported from Theresienstadt to ghettos and killing sites in the east. And yet this was not the full measure of Heydrich's impact on the war. because on January 20th, 1942, just 4 months before that May morning in Prague, Heydrich had presided over a conference at a villa on the Wannsee on the southwestern edge of Berlin that represented something beyond even the horrors already being committed. He had gathered 15 senior officials of the Nazi government and the SS, representatives of the Foreign Ministry, the Ministries of Justice and the Interior, and occupation authorities from the conquered East. And in the conference room of that villa, Heydrich had laid before them, in the language of bureaucratic precision, the coordinated plan for the murder of every Jewish man, woman, and child in German-occupied Europe. The plan, authorized by Hitler, designated the SS, specifically the RSHA, under Heydrich's command, as the coordinating authority for what the Nazis euphemistically called the final solution of the Jewish question. By the time those 15 men left that conference room, the architecture of the Holocaust was complete. It needed only implementation. This was the man in the approaching car. His Mercedes, a green, open-topped 320 Cabriolet B, had left his home at Penensk-Brezhny, a village 14 kilometers north of central Prague, at 10:30 that morning. He traveled the same route to his headquarters at Prague Castle that he had traveled many times before, and he traveled it with an open roof and without additional security escort. This was not thoughtlessness. It was a deliberate statement, a performance of confidence in the completeness of his pacification. By the spring of 1942, acts of sabotage in the Protectorate had fallen by 73% from their peak. Czech workers offered wages and rations equivalent to those of their German counterparts, had largely ceased open resistance. Heydrich believed with documented conviction that he had broken the spirit of Czech resistance entirely. In the daily life of occupied Prague, there appeared to be nothing threatening, nothing waiting, nothing hidden. He was wrong about all of it. 100 meters north of the hairpin curve at Liebeck, a third man stood at his post. His name was Joseph Walczyk, a member of the Silver A resistance group, and his role that morning was simple. He held a mirror. When Heydrich's car appeared at the top of the hill, he angled the mirror to catch the pale May sun and flashed it briefly toward the two men waiting below. It was a signal that needed no words. The car was coming. The story of how those two men, Joseph Gabzik and Jan Kubis, came to be standing at that tram stop on that particular morning is itself a story of extraordinary purpose. It begins in London in the autumn of 1941 in the offices of František Moravec, the head of Czechoslovak military intelligence, operating from exile. Moravec had watched Heydrich's appointment to Prague with a cold understanding of what it meant. He had approached Brigadier Colin Gubbins of the British Special Operations Executive with a proposal: select the best available soldiers from among the 2,000 exiled Czechoslovak fighting men then based in Britain, train them under SO supervision, and parachute them into occupied Bohemia with a single objective. The operation was given the code name Anthropoid, a word derived from the Greek meaning having the form of a human. The name was deliberately obscure. The mission was not. On October 28, 1941, Czechoslovakia's own Independence Day, Moravec personally selected 2 soldiers for the primary mission. Warrant Officer Joseph Gabzik was Slovak. Staff Sergeant Jan Kubis was Czech. Both had served. in the Czechoslovak army before the occupation. Both had escaped to France after the fall of 1939, had fought with Allied forces in France, and had evacuated to Britain with the Czechoslovak units that continued the fight from exile. They were selected not because they were the most famous soldiers or the most celebrated, but because Moravec judged them the most capable of carrying an impossible burden with discipline and without breaking. They were sent to one of the SOE's commando training centers at Arasig on the remote western coast of Scotland, where they trained in weapons handling, close quarters combat, parachute technique, and the specific disciplines of covert operations behind enemy lines. The modified No. 73 grenade that would be carried in Kubis's briefcase was developed by Cecil Vanderpeer Clark, a INSO weapons engineer who had stripped the original weapon's weight down until it could be thrown by a man on foot, while retaining sufficient force to destroy an armored vehicle. The briefcase was not an afterthought. It was a design choice. It was the difference between a soldier and a civilian. In a city under occupation, a man carrying a briefcase attracted no particular attention. On the night of December 28, 1941, Gabzik and Kubis, together with 7 other soldiers divided into 2 separate groups, Silver A and Silver B, were loaded into a Handley Page Halifax heavy bomber of No. 138 Squadron RF at RAF Tangmere and flown across the North Sea and over the dark landscape of occupied Europe. They departed at 10 o'clock at night. Over the Protectorate, navigation difficulties caused the aircraft to drop each group in the wrong location. Gabzik and Kubis came down near the village of Novizdy, east of Prague, buried in cold winter fields that were not where they were supposed to be. They recovered their equipment. They made contact with local resistance members, and from that winter darkness they began making their way toward Prague. They would spend the next 5 months living in safe houses maintained by Czech resistance families who understood with complete clarity that if any of them were discovered, torture and death were the certain outcomes. Those families sheltered them anyway. The resistance leaders inside occupied Prague, when they learned the full nature of the mission, begged the government in exile in London to abort it. Their message was recorded and has been preserved in the historical archives. An attempt against Heydrich's life, they warned, would be of no use to the Allies, and its consequences for the Czech people would be immeasurable. President Edvard Denise, the head of the government in exile, received that message. He acknowledged it, and he sent back word that the operation must proceed. Benez understood something that the resistance inside the Protectorate could perhaps not afford to weigh so coldly that Czechoslovakia needed, in the eyes of the Allied powers and the world, to demonstrate that it remained a fighting nation, that it had not been absorbed and pacified without remainder, that 2 men with a briefcase and a Sten gun could strike at the apex of Nazi terror and draw blood. The political stakes were, in Benez's calculation, existential, and so the order held. The 3 plans for the assassination came and went as geography and circumstance made each of them impossible. Killing Heydrich on a train was ruled out after examination of the practicalities. An ambush on a forest road was attempted. The men waited at the site for hours, but the operation was called off before the target appeared. The final plan was the simplest and the most exposed. They would wait at the hairpin curve in Liebeck, where the road's geometry would force Heydrich's car to slow, and they would act in the open, in daylight, among civilians, with no guarantee of escape. They chose that vulnerability deliberately. They had done the mathematics of their own survival. The mathematics were unfavorable. They went anyway. The green Mercedes came around the top of the hill at 10:30 on the morning of May 27, 1942. Walsick caught the pale sun in his mirror. The signal flashed. Below at the curve, Joseph Gabzik let the raincoat drop from his arm. He raised at sea. Sten gun. He aimed. He pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. The Sten jammed. The spring loaded the bolt, but the round failed to feed into the chamber. A failure to feed that has been documented in post-war accounts and confirmed by weapons historians. Czechoslovak paratroopers, who trained with British SO equipment, regularly noted the low reliability of the Sten under operational conditions, particularly when the weapon had been concealed and its mechanism had not been recently cleared. In that fraction of a second, the entire operation hung by the thread of a single mechanical failure. Heydrich stood up in the open car. He drew his Luger pistol. He was not a man who instinctively retreated, even wounded as he was about to. The documented record shows that his first impulse was aggressive. He called for his driver to halt rather than accelerate. His driver, SS Oberscharführer Johannes Klein, brought the Mercedes to a stop precisely at the worst possible position, directly in front of Jan Kubis. Kubis, who had not been seen in the initial chaos of the Jan Sten, opened the briefcase. He threw the modified No. 73 grenade at the car. He misjudged the throw. The grenade did not land inside the open vehicle as intended. It struck against the rear wheel arch of the Mercedes and detonated. The blast shattered the windows of a tram that had just stopped on the opposite side of the road and sent shrapnel scattering across the street. 2 SS uniform jackets folded on the back seat were blasted upward by the force of the explosion and draped themselves incongruously over the nearby trolley wire. Kubis himself received a minor wound to his face from the shrapnel. A bystander was also struck. The detonation was not surgical. It was not clean, but it was enough. The fragments of the grenade ripped through the right rear fender of the Mercedes and drove into Heydrich from the left side. The blast embedded shrapnel, fragments of horsehair upholstery, wire, and fabric into his diaphragm, spleen, and left lung. It fractured the 11th rib. The damage was severe, though not, as the medics who reached him would initially assess, immediately fatal. Heydrich himself leapt from the car, drew his Luger, and staggered toward Gabzik, his face pale, his side torn open, returning fire. He managed several steps before his body overruled him. He doubled over against the side of the road. He caught himself on the railings with one hand. His driver, Klein, ran toward Kubis. Heydrich, his voice somehow still carrying authority, despite the wounds opening in his chest, turned toward the retreating Gabzik and said, in his last coherent moment before shock began to take him, "Get that bastard." Both men escaped. Gabzik fled into a nearby butcher shop, encountered its Nazi-sympathizing owner, fought his way through and out, wounded Klein twice in the leg, and vanished onto a passing tram. Cubis mounted his bicycle and rode away through the crowd of terrified civilians spilling off the tram. Neither man knew in those first desperate minutes whether Heydrich was dead. They had seen him standing. They had seen him firing. The GN mission seemed, from their perspective, to have failed. It had not failed. But the truth of that would take 8 days to emerge. A Czech woman and an off-duty policeman reached Heydrich first. They flagged down a passing delivery van and lifted him, carefully, into the back. He was taken to Bulovka Hospital in Prague, where a team of surgeons, led by Professor Hallbaum, a Silesian German, who chaired surgery at Charles University, operated on him that same afternoon. They re-inflated the collapsed left lung. They sutured the torn diaphragm. They removed the spleen, which contained a fragment of the grenade and pieces of the car's upholstery. They removed the tip of the shattered 11th rib. They inserted drainage catheters and closed the chest. Himmler dispatched his personal physician, Karl Gebhardt, who flew to Prague and arrived that evening, and took charge of Heydrich's post-operative care. In the first days after surgery, Heydrich appeared to be recovering. His condition was serious but was not deteriorating. A new antibacterial drug, sulfanilamide, was available and had been recommended by Hitler's personal physician, Theodor Morell. Gebhardt, seeing what appeared to be stabilization, declined to administer it. The decision would be the last fatal error in the chain that began with a jammed stent and continued to this hospital bed in occupied Prague on June 2nd. Himmler came to visit his most capable subordinate. Heydrich, feverish but conscious, recited to him a passage from one of his father's operas, a piece of music about fate and surrender to what the universe had already decided. The world is just a barrel organ which the Lord God turns himself. We all have to dance to the tune which is already on the drum. It was the most human thing Reinhard Heydrich had apparently said in years, and he said it in a hospital bed to the one man who perhaps understood him as completely as anyone could. It was the last lucid conversation of his life. On June 3rd, while sitting up to eat a noon meal, a small signal of apparent recovery that had encouraged his physicians, Heydrich suddenly went into shock. He slipped into a deep coma from which he did not emerge. On Thursday, June 4th, 1942, at approximately 4:30 in the morning, Reinhard Heydrich died. The official cause of death recorded in the Bulovka Hospital register was wound infection and sepsis. The autopsy found fat particles and blood clots in the right ventricle and pulmonary artery, and severe pulmonary edema in the upper lobes of both lungs. The infection that killed him had most likely been seated at the moment of the blast, when the horsehair fibers from the car's upholstery, carried inward on the shrapnel with the force of the explosion, were embedded deep in the tissue of his chest. They had festered unseen in the hours that followed. The antibiotic that might have stopped the infection had not been administered, and so the man whom Hitler had privately called the most dangerous person in the Reich died not from a clean bullet wound, not from an instantly lethal blast, but from an infection in his chest that spread silently over 8 days while the Gestapo turned occupied Czechoslovakia upside down, searching for the men who had thrown the briefcase. The state funeral was held in Berlin on June 9, 1942. Hitler stood before the coffin in the Reich Chancellery. He decorated the body with medals. He delivered a eulogy in which he described Heydrich as one of the best National Socialists, one of the staunchest defenders of the concept of the German Reich, and one of the greatest opponents of all enemies of this Reich. Hitler was not merely mourning a subordinate. He was publicly eulogizing the man who had been the operating center of the Holocaust's administrative machinery, and privately raging at the security lapse that had allowed 2 paratroopers with a briefcase to remove him. The reprisals began immediately and did not end for months. On June 9th, the day of Heydrich's state funeral, Hitler ordered retaliatory measures against the Czech population. An estimated 13,000 people were arrested. Approximately 5,000 would be killed in the weeks that followed. At the Tbilisi shooting range in Prague, over 500 Czechs were executed in May and June of 1942 alone. Memorial plaques bearing their names stand at that range to this day. But the most complete expression of what Nazism did in the face of defiance was what happened to a village called Lidice. Lidice was a small mining community of perhaps 500 inhabitants, located 20 kilometers west of Prague. A connection, circumstantial, as it would later be established, had been drawn between the village and one of the paratroopers. It was enough. On the night of June 9th and into June 10th, 1942, German police units arrived. All male inhabitants. Over the age of 15, 173 men and boys were shot in groups in a farmyard garden on the edge of the village, while their wives and daughters watched. The 184 women of Lidice were transported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Of the 88 children taken from Lidice, all but a small number selected for forced Germanization were murdered, sent to the Chelmno extermination camp and killed with carbon monoxide gas. The buildings of Lidice were then burned to the ground, the rubble demolished, the foundations blown up, and the earth leveled. Nazi engineers rerouted a stream that ran through the village, so that no trace of water would mark where it had stood. The name Lidice was struck from official maps. Germany wished to erase not just the village, but the fact of its existence. A second village, Lekaki, was destroyed by identical means several weeks later. 294 relatives of the assassinated paratroopers, parents, siblings, cousins, were executed at the Mauthausen concentration camp. 262 of them on a single day, October 24, 1942, and yet Gabzik and Kubis were still alive. For nearly 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, 7 Czechoslovak paratroopers, including Gabzik, Kubis, and Valzik, were hidden in the crypt beneath the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague's new town. They had been sheltered there by the extraordinary courage of the cathedral's bishop, Gorazd Pavlik, and by the priests and helpers who moved between the city above and the stone chambers below, carrying food and messages. The briefcase was gone now. The mission was accomplished, or as accomplished as it would ever be. What remained was the waiting, the knowledge that the city above them was being turned inside out, that every available Gestapo agent and SS soldier was searching, and that the circle of those who knew their location was growing in size with the growing desperation of the occupation authorities. The circle broke on June 13, 1942. Karol Kurda was a fellow Czechoslovak parachutist, a member of a separate group called Outdistance, who had been dropped into the Protectorate with a different, mission and had watched the reprisals mount with increasing terror. He had seen what the Nazis did to Litis. He had made a calculation, the particular calculation of a man in whom fear had permanently displaced principle. And on June 13, he walked into Gestapo headquarters in Prague. He traded the names, the addresses, and the hiding places of his comrades and their helpers for a reward of 1,000,000 Reichsmarks, a German identity, and a German wife. He would live until 1947, when a post-war Czechoslovak court tried him for treason, and he was hanged for it at dawn on June 18, 1942. 3 weeks and 2 days after the assassination, 750 SS soldiers surrounded the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius. They had learned through Kurta's information and through subsequent torture of the resistance helpers exactly where the paratroopers were concealed. They closed every street. They sealed every exit. And then they came in. What followed lasted. For more than 6 hours, the 7 paratroopers held the crypt. They had pistols, submachine guns, and grenades, and they used all of them with documented effectiveness against an assault force that outnumbered them by more than 100 to 1. 3 of the paratroopers, including Jan Kubis, held the upper level of the church and the choir loft where they fought until they were killed. 4 more, including Joseph Gabzik, were barricaded in the stone crypt below the main floor, in a space so confined that the Germans tried to flood it by attaching fire hoses to the cathedral's ventilation shafts and pumping water in from outside. The paratroopers in the crypt shot through the shaft to disable the hoses. An SS officer was sent under a flag of truce to call through the ventilation window and urge them to surrender. Traitor Karol Kurda was also brought to the site and made to call through the window in Czech, telling the men that there was no escape and that surrender was their only option. Not one of the 7 men in that building ever surrendered. When the water from the fire hoses had risen to the level of their chests, and the ammunition in their pistols was nearly exhausted, the last 4 paratroopers took their own lives rather than be taken prisoner. Joseph Gabzik was among them. Jan Kubis had already died fighting in the nave above. Joseph Walczyk, who had stood with a mirror in the pale May sun 3 weeks before and signaled the approaching car, was dead. All 7 were gone. Bishop Garasht was arrested. He was tortured and executed. The priests who had sheltered the paratroopers were executed. The families who had provided safe houses across Prague were hunted down. The radius of death that spread outward from those 7 men was enormous, and still, in its full human accounting, impossible to measure completely. And yet, the name that was given to the single largest operation of the Holocaust, the operation under which the SS and police murdered approximately 1,700,000 Jews in the extermination camps at Belkik, Sobibor, and Treblinka, was not named after Himmler. It was not named after Göring or Goebbels or any of the other architects of the Reich's terror. It was named Operation Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich, named after the man who had been killed by 2 paratroopers with a briefcase at a tram stop in Prague. The Nazis named the Holocaust's central killing operation after him because they understood, as history has confirmed, that Heydrich had been its engine. His removal from the war, however violent the reprisals it generated, removed from the German state its most capable administrator of genocide. The RSHA that he had built and the final solution that he had structured would continue. The machine never stopped, but it had lost irreversibly. The one mind that understood every moving part of it with absolute command. Hitler's own assessment of what Heydrich's death cost the German state was privately unambiguous. That a man as irreplaceable as Heydrich should expose himself to unnecessary danger, Hitler told those around him afterward, he could only condemn as stupid and idiotic. This was not grief speaking. It was the frustration of a strategist recognizing, too late, the magnitude of a loss. The man he had trusted to administer his most secret and most terrible designs was dead, carried out of Prague in a coffin draped in swastikas, killed by Anne. Infection seeded by the horsehair upholstery of his own car, and the imperfect grenade thrown by a Czech soldier who had misjudged his throw and still, somehow, changed history. Operation Anthropoid was the only verified government-sponsored assassination of a senior Nazi leader during the entire Second World War. That fact alone places it in a category of its own. But the true weight of its significance cannot be measured only in those terms, because the significance does not belong solely to the act. It belongs to the actors. It belongs to the 2,000 exiled Czechoslovak soldiers in Britain who could have quietly waited out the war in relative safety, and instead trained in the freezing mountains of western Scotland for a mission that almost none of them expected to survive. It belongs to the families of Prague who fed and sheltered men they knew were hunted, understanding that discovery meant death, and sheltered them anyway. It belongs to Bishop Gorasht, who hid 7 soldiers in his crypt and was executed for it, without recantation. It belongs to the women of Lidis, taken to Ravensbrück, who carried the name of a village that no longer existed on any German map, in the only archive that could not be demolished, memory. There is a museum now beneath the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague. The crypt where the 4 paratroopers made their final stand has been preserved. The walls still carry the marks of the bullets and the flood damage from the fire hoses. At the ambush site on the curve at Líbek, there is a memorial. In Slovakia, the name of Joseph Gabčík is taught to children in schools. In the Czech Republic, Jan Kubis is remembered by his nation as a national hero, which is what he was by every historical measure. The bullet holes in the stone walls of the crypt in Prague are not patched or filled. They are left exactly as they are because stone that has been struck by bullets fired in the last defense of freedom by men who refused to be taken alive is not stone that should be repaired. The briefcase is gone. It was a simple object, brown, worn at the corners, entirely unremarkable, the kind of briefcase a clerk might carry to a morning appointment. In the history of the Second World War, in the long inventory of weapons and machines and strategies and operations, it does not appear in any list of great armaments. It fired no shells. It carried no soldiers. It did not fly above enemy cities or prowl beneath the surface of the Atlantic. It held a single modified grenade that its carrier threw imperfectly at the wrong angle against a rear wheel arch instead of into the open body of the car in a moment of chaos and noise and adrenaline and the sudden mechanical failure of the weapon in the hands of the man beside him, and that imperfect throw by that ordinary object in the hands of one Czech soldier who had traveled from Arasig to RAF Tangmere to a freezing field near Nevisdy, and 5 months through occupied Prague to a tram stop at a hairpin curve on a pale May morning. That imperfect throw was enough. Not enough to stop the Holocaust. Not enough to end the war, but enough to prove, against every demonstration of German invulnerability that had seemed so total since 1939, that the men at the top of that system were mortal, that the SS and the Gestapo and the RSHA could be reached, that 2 men, a Slovak and a Czech, trained by the British, set by their government in exile, sheltered by ordinary families in an occupied city, could alter the trajectory of the war's darkest chapter by standing at a tram stop in the spring, dropping a raincoat, and refusing to run when the gun failed. The world, as Heydrich himself had quoted in his final conscious hours, is just a barrel organ which the Lord God turns himself. We all have to dance to the tune which is already on the drum. On June 4th, 1942, in a hospital bed in Prague at 4:30 in the morning, Reinhard Heydrich danced to it. And in the silence that followed, somewhere beneath the cobblestones and the tram lines and the pale spring light of a city still under occupation, the record of history turned, quietly, irreversibly, and in the direction of those who had refused to stop fighting.